Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'm very delighted to be here this afternoon and to have the honor and privilege of addressing a very important subject. The topic that I have been asked to address is resolving Nigeria's constitution question. Resolving Nigeria's constitution question. The topic itself presupposes that a question mark hangs over the Nigerian constitution. And what then is that question mark? This invariably arises from the preamble to the Nigerian constitution, which states that the constitution was made by we, the people. And for those who are familiar with the context in which the 1999 constitution emerged, the question that invariably arises is whether there is a legitimacy deficit that we confront. There's a great deal of debate about that, and I wouldn't have, unfortunately, the privilege of the time to address that question. But I think what is critical is that, as the Nigerian constitution rightly points out in section 14, subsection 2A, sovereignty belongs to the people of Nigeria, from whom government, through the constitution, derives all its authority and power. And if the Nigerian constitution is made by we, the people, then it becomes imperative that the Nigerian people are front and center, that the Nigerian people are at the heart of Nigeria's constitutional experience. And it also means that in the context of this constitutional amendment exercise, we are conscious of that imperative. In his remarks this morning, the Deputy Speaker of the House of Representatives and Chairman of the House of Representatives Committee on Constitutional Review made a very fundamental clarion call to what he calls bold and decisive action. And it invariably follows that in the context of the exercise that is unfolding, all the mandate bearers must be bold and decisive. So in terms of the question of legitimacy of the Constitution, clearly the reality is that there is a recurring debate about the legitimacy of the Nigerian Constitution, and this has generated contentions, contestations, and clarion calls for amendments. There are those who have argued, for instance, that members of the National Assembly are not competent to make fundamental alterations to the Constitution or to make fundamental changes to its fundamental structures and fundamental principles. There's a great deal of debate about that, and part of the reason why that question arises is that, quite apart from the context in which the Constitution emerged, there is also the fact that the Nigerian Constitution in section 9 does not address the question of a referendum. This is something that perhaps over the course of time you might need to engage in the context of constitutional amendment. I would like to focus on results, and therefore I would like to engage the experiences that we have had, especially since 2010, when, as Clement Wanko pointed out, we had the very first alteration exercise. And I've had the privilege of being part of this process at certain points in time, and I'd like to focus on some of the experiences over the course of time. Of course, we're familiar that from 2010 we have had alterations from numbers 1 to the last exercise, which was number 5 alteration, and my expectation is that we will now have a 6th alteration that will be very profound in its outcome. So what are some of the lessons? Because I like to focus on results. What are some of the lessons that we need to learn from the previous exercises so that we have optimal performance? And the very first is the fact that you must be strategic in planning and commence early. And I'm very happy that the Deputy Speaker of the House of Representatives has indicated that you have given yourselves a timeline of 24 months This is very critical for three major reasons. The first is that there might be a number of amendments that have implications for the conduct of the 2027 elections. And the sooner you are over and done with that aspect of the amendment, the easier it is for the Independent National Electoral Commission to better prepare for the 2027 elections. The second reason is that if you don't get over and done with this in good time, the more it drags to the 2027 elections, the more the likelihood that the honorable members and the senators will be looking at every item through a political lens. And the third is that if you drag this to the 2027 elections, the likelihood is that electioneering campaigns now become the order of the day, and you won't have the attention and focus that you need in order to constructively engage the Constitution Amendment exercise. The second, drawing from our experience in previous exercises, and I'm glad again that the Deputy Speaker of the House of Representatives has underscored this fact, is that you need to build consensus. Nigeria is a very diverse country, and it is extremely critical that we build consensus. And as a matter of fact, if you need to amend the Constitution, there are some aspects of the Constitution that require a threshold of 2/3. But there are some of them that require a threshold of 4/5. And so if you don't build consensus in a spirit of give and take, then it will be very difficult for us to achieve our goals. The third lesson is that you must be prepared to walk across party lines. This National Assembly is probably the most diverse in terms of the representation of different political parties. And you must be prepared to walk across party lines, and in doing so, you must focus on the national interest. And focusing on the national interest means that you must be deliberate in avoiding political grandstanding and brinkmanship. I would urge all of you to be driven by the courage of your convictions and in the overarching interest of the Nigerian state. And when it comes to the subject of courage, I often reference the statement attributed to a former senator of the United States, Senator John McCain. And John McCain says that courage is not the absence of fear, but the capacity for action in spite of our fears. Over the course of this exercise, you may be called upon to take bold and decisive action that requires courage and the courage of your convictions. The fourth point is the imperative of stakeholder engagement. And I'm very delighted that part of what we are going to be doing today is citizenship engagement. And engagement is very critical because the people are at the heart of the exercise. And therefore the exercise must be people-centered. You must feel the pulse of the people, and you must give expression to the interest of the people. In this respect, working with your counterparts in the Senate, it will become very critical to engage with civil society, to engage with traditional rulers, some of whom are here, to engage with religious leaders, to engage with the media, to engage with political parties and other critical stakeholders in the Nigerian project. I would like to also say, and this is lesson number 5, strategy is key. Because without strategy, this becomes really an exercise that is not focused. And one of the things that we learned in the course of previous exercises is that you might find that there are a number of bills in respect of which there is consensus, and yet there are others that are very contentious. And what we have learned in previous exercises is that where you have reached consensus in respect of some key issues, you should have separate standalone bills in respect of those issues. Because if you lump them with the very contentious issues, the likelihood is that you pass it in the House of Representatives and you get stuck in the Senate and vice versa, or you pass it in the National Assembly and by the time you get to the state, you are confronted with challenges there, or you are able to get this passed all through these processes, and yet you find that there is a challenge at the level of presidential accent. The 6th lesson is that there must be synergy between the two chambers of the National Assembly. As you would recall, in the course of one of the earlier constitutional amendment exercises, there was a joint National Assembly committee on the review of the Constitution. And there were questions about who would chair the session. The Senate said, well, we will chair the session. The House of Representatives said, we will chair the session. And at the end of the day, it took a long time before this was resolved, and we now had co-chairs of the committee. And so it is important that there is synergy, because in the context of constitutional amendment, both chambers of the National Assembly have co-equal powers. And it is important that you work in a symbiotic manner to achieve your goals. Lesson number 7, and this is extremely critical, is that you must have strategic engagement with your colleagues at the state assemblies. As you know, members of the state houses of assembly have a role to play in this respect. And in the last exercise, we had a major challenge. And I think that that challenge was unprecedented. After members of the National Assembly were over and done with the exercise, and I recall, as a lead consultant to the House of Representatives Committee on Constitutional Review, that speakers of state houses of assembly were invited for an interactive session with the National Assembly committees. But then it turned out that by the time the National Assembly was over and done with its exercise, and the bills were transmitted to state houses of assembly, something unprecedented happened. The Conference of Speakers, and I'm glad that the chairman of the Conference of Speakers of State Houses of Assembly is here. The Conference of Speakers now wrote back to the National Assembly and said they were not going to take any further legislative action in respect of the bills transmitted to them for concurrence unless their own priority bills were passed by the National Assembly. And as you would recall, those of you who followed that development, there was quite a bit of challenge between the National Assembly. I recall that the Deputy Senate President and the Deputy Speaker of the House of the 9th Assembly addressed a press conference. And so we had a back and forth that unfortunately impeded the action that was needed in respect of that exercise. And so I'm glad that very early in the day, and as the Speaker of the Oyo State House of Assembly, who is the Chairman of the Conference of Speakers, has rightly indicated, it is a very welcome development that very early in the day you're already engaging the State Houses of Assembly. And my hope is that you will have synergy in terms of your actions going forward. The 8th lesson is that you must have periodic consultation and partnership with the executive. At the state level, on paper, there is no specific role for state governors, but we all know that governors wield considerable influence over what happens in respect of this exercise at the state level. And therefore, you must find some way of feeling the pulse of the executive. And at the federal level, of course, the reality is that you may go through the entire gamut of the exercise, and by the time it gets to the president, you find that there is a veto. You would recall that in the 9th Assembly, as many as 36 bills for constitutional amendment were passed at the National Assembly and at the level of the state assemblies. These went to Mr. President, and if my recollection is correct, only 16 of them were assented to by Mr. President. And the current president, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, then assented to one other one that has to do with the judiciary in terms of the uniform retirement age. So, feeling the pulse of the executive over the course of the exercise is critical. Number 9, you must be deliberate in countering the narrative that these exercises are simply annual rituals and money-spinning jamborees. As a matter of fact, as recently as yesterday, when I told one of my colleagues that I was going to be addressing this gathering today, he said one of the things you must emphasize is that there is a general perception, rightly or wrongly, that these are just hollow exercises. Now, how do you engage that? For those of us that have been part of this process, we know that that is not correct. But it means that you must be deliberate in a robust media engagement to get the people to appreciate the relevance of this exercise. But one of the most significant ways through which you can counter that narrative is to deliver results. If you deliver results in a manner that is profound, and as the Deputy Speaker pointed out, if you are bold and decisive, then of course you will be able to demonstrate to the Nigerian people that this exercise is worth it. The 10th point is, and I think this also comes out of the speech made by the Deputy Speaker, is the need for impact assessment. I give you an example. In the 9th Assembly, one of the signature accomplishments was the devolution of powers in respect of correctional services, in respect of rails, in respect of power, and yet, almost a year afterwards, we are not seeing significant effort to domesticate these initiatives at the state level. And you need, at the level of this committee and at the level of the National Assembly in total, to take stock, undertake an impact assessment so that it provides you a compass for action going forward. And you need to constructively engage with the sub-nationals so that you are able to collaborate with them in order to ensure that the work that you have done is given effect to at the subnational level. The 11th lesson, and the last on this, is that you must set your eyes on the crowning glory. At the end of this exercise, you must be able to say to yourselves, what is the crowning glory? In other words, what is the signature accomplishment of this exercise? I give you a few examples. In respect of the 8th Assembly, the signature accomplishment of that assembly in respect of constitutional amendment was in relation to the not too young to run amendment. Now, whether that has translated into greater representation of younger people in the National Assembly is a different question. In respect of the 9th Assembly, I believe that the signature accomplishments were the devolution of powers in respect of power, rail, correctional services, as I have pointed out, but also the financial independence of state legislatures and state judiciaries. And I think that these are very critical and we need to keep this in mind. So, as I wind down, for the 10th Assembly, at the end of this exercise, what will be your signature accomplishment that inspires confidence in the Nigerian people? Is it going to be in the area of devolution, of power, of policing power? And I know, for instance, that the Deputy Speaker and some other members of the National Assembly have sponsored a bill on the subject of devolution of policing. Is that going to be your signature accomplishment? I am aware that in the 9th Assembly, this was almost passed. But I recall that when we had a joint meeting of the House of Representatives Committee and the Senate Committee, there was apprehension on the part of members of the National Assembly that there was the likelihood of abuse of the state police by the state governors. And that apprehension truncated this exercise at the National Assembly level. Now here we are, and it turns out that one of the counter demands of the speakers of the state houses of assembly was actually in relation to devolution of policing powers. And we need to find a way of addressing this. If you are able to address this with the profundity that is required, it may well be one of your signature accomplishments. The other issue is the gender mainstreaming bills. I recall that there were at least 3 significant bills that had to do with the question of gender, and Clement Wanko underscored this in his remarks. This is something I would urge you to take a second look at, and it may well be one of your signature accomplishments. Or is it going to be the subject of the administrative and financial independence of local governments? You would recall that this was passed, and then it was quite a challenge at the level of the states. So, focus on the bigger picture. What is the crowning glory, and what will be your signature accomplishments? If I had the luxury of time, I would reel out some other issues that I believe you need to engage, but I don't have that privilege. But let me make a general appeal to Nigerians. Nigerians need to get involved in this exercise and be deeply invested in the vitality of our democratic institutions. As I close, I want to challenge all of you, members of the National Assembly, to rise to the occasion. I go back to what the Deputy Speaker said in his remarks, which was a call to bold and decisive action. You have been tasked with the responsibility of resolving the Constitution question. This is a mandate that the Constitution reposes in you and other mandate bearers. And the question I'm going to leave you with, are you willing and determined to write your names in gold in the annals of Nigeria's constitutional history? I thank you for your kind attention.